Hagsploitation, otherwise known as Psycho-Biddy, Hag Horror, Grande Dame Guignol, and other monikers, is a subgenre of both the thriller and horror genres. Since Hagsploitation's a lot more fun to say, that's what we're going to call it today. Now, this very specific niche female-led subgenre first became popular in the early 1960s up and through the 1970s, after which it sort of petered out and died in its sleep. But that's not to say it disappeared entirely. In fact, Hagsploitation and Hagsploitation-adjacent movies have been made even as recently as 2022. Today, I'd like to take a closer look at the subgenre, what it entails, how it came to be, why it came to be, and the elements and themes that are problematic and not so problematic, as well as more controversial aspects in academia that are very well beloved amongst its small but very vocal fanbase. My name's Alexandra, aka Obsessive Filma, and welcome to my deep dive in Hagsploitation. Before we begin, there's some historical context that's kind of necessary to talk about this in depth. First of all, I wasn't entirely accurate just now. It didn't start in the early 1960s, but in fact can be traced as far back as the late 1800s and early 1900s with a very specific type of theater. There was a type of theater colloquially named Grande Guignol after its origin in Paris's infamous and wildly popular Théâtre de Grande Guignol, where a certain type of short-form play delighted and terrified its audiences. Graphic, shocking, and always with buckets of gore, these horror shows were different than your usual adaptations of classic horror stories. They adopted a more naturalistic approach, exploring realistic anxieties such as madness, paranoia, and sadism at the forefront, whilst examining contemporary society in all of its cruelty, unfairness, and hypocrisies. The plays rejected the idea of horror as escapism, and along with graphic murders, audiences were confronted with social commentary, philosophical musings about the plight of the working class, and intelligent insights you wouldn't expect to find in the Victorian French version of B-grade slashers. This approach wound up laying the groundwork for what was to come. Fast forward several decades, and it's the golden age of Hollywood, the years between the 1930s and the late 1950s. All of the men are absolutely dashing and very handsome indeed. All of the ladies are very glamorous and devastatingly beautiful. Their work showing a mastery of the craft that cements them in history as gods and goddesses of the screen, and they're all owned by the studios like cattle. As an actress, if you were lucky or rather unlucky enough to be considered leading lady material, there were a lot of very rigid and often stifling standards that were set down to you by the studio execs whose job it was to make as much money off of the idea of you rather than the person you are as possible. For instance, one common one was the control of your body. You had to maintain a certain weight, and therefore this encouraged a lot of people to develop eating disorders and to also abuse drugs like dexedrine in order to stay skinny. One of the more insidious ones, however, was the control of your total public image. You had to be as pure as the driven snow both on and off screen, as chaste, inoffensive, and pure as the characters that you would portray. And it wasn't just the studios either. The audiences had their own expectations of you, specifically that you would play a certain type of character in pretty much every movie that you were in. I mean, no one's going to go see wide-eyed ingenue Judy Garland who sings about bluebirds over the rainbow playing Marge, the chain-smoking laundromat owner who moonlights as the MC of a dogfighting ring. Actually, now that I think about it, I would totally pay so much money to go see that movie, but I digress. However, all good things must come to an end, and the golden age did in the late 1950s. Its former box office darlings were approaching, if not surpassing, middle age, and there was a new influx of New York-trained method actors such as Marlon Brando, who pioneered the new Hollywood era. There wasn't exactly a dry-up for roles for the previous generation, though. Actors such as Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, and Gregory Peck, among others, found themselves playing more mature roles in films that were centered around older male protagonists. But that's kind of the key phrase here, older male. The women, conversely, had no place in the limelight anymore because they had committed the cardinal sin of Hollywood. They dared to age. In Hollywood then, much as in Hollywood now, a woman's value was inextricably linked to how youthful and beautiful she was. Of course, there have always been exceptions, but think about it. How many roles has Jamie Lee Curtis played of the sultry femme fatale after she's hit 50. But then, as it always does, the horror genre made a place for those who no longer belonged in their former place, welcoming these older actresses with open arms, all because of the smash hit success of one movie in 1962 called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was the result of a long and very complicated series of events that started as far back as 1933, but the catalyst for the film itself was in early 1962 when actress Joan Crawford picked up a novel by Henry Farrell, read it, decided it needed to be made into a movie, and made it so. Her co-star and rival, Bette Davis, had both been two of the most beautiful, successful, and sought-after actresses in old Hollywood, but at this point they hadn't had a hit in about 10 years and their careers had taken a real slump in the 1950s. Now, I've found some conflicting sources about the budget, so it was either less than $750,000 or it was around about $980,000, which either way is the definition of shoestring. Now, the actresses believed in this so much. They believed in Robert Aldrich's vision, they believed in the love of the craft, and they believed in this movie so much that they decided that they were going to take a massive pay cut compared to what they used to command. And instead, they negotiated a share of the box office results, which honestly was probably the best decision they could have made. When Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers Studios and all-around just super guy, found out that Crawford and Davis were headlining a new project, his response was oh so charmingly, "I wouldn't give a plug nickel for either of those two old broads." Now, I'm going to do my best to interpret this as generously as I can because I'm a generous person and Jack Warner does not deserve any generosity whatsoever. But I'm going to say that he was expressing his trepidation that these two women, who were both in their early 50s, were the main characters of a new film, and he wondered how audiences would react to that. The two women, both powerhouses in their own right, set about making sure that he and all the other detractors knew that they weren't quite ready to be sent to a nice farm upstate yet. Especially Bette Davis, who pushed Aldrich towards two decisions that ended up elevating the film from his original vision into the iconic film it is today. Namely, Baby Jane's deranged-looking makeup, as you will see in the following clips, and also to film in black and white as opposed to color, which was his original intention, because, in her words, it would make a sad story look pretty. Honestly, I could do an entire 2-hour-long video just about Crawford, Davis, and this movie, but instead I'm going to give you basically like the gist and bare bones of what happens, because I think that this is one of those movies that you have to see at least once in your life. Like, no joke, one of my favorite horror movies of all time, and that list is lengthy, but this is in the top 5. In fact, if you haven't seen Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, as a recommendation, I would say pause this video, or if you must watch until the end directly afterward, go and rent it from Amazon Prime or Apple TV, or I think Google Play has it for about $3, and this is July of 2023, by the way. So watch it, money very well spent. I'll be here when you get back. We begin in 1917, where Baby Jane Hudson is a vaudeville child star performing to sold-out crowds nightly, much to the envy of her overshadowed sister Blanche, who secretly craves the limelight for herself and simmers in resentment over the adoration Jane receives from her fans. Skipping ahead to 1935, we see the situations have reversed. Vaudeville is dead, long live the motion picture, and Blanche has proven to be a very talented and very successful actress, whereas Jane has proven to be quite the opposite. The plot's inciting incident comes when the two sisters drive home from a party. The audience only sees them from the waist down, so we can't tell who is driving and who is in the passenger seat. The latter sister gets out to open the gate to their ridiculously vast mansion, and the former suddenly floors it, crashing into the gate, and presumably her sister. That's what brings us to what the title card informs us is Yesterday, 1962. By the way, you overslept. Blanche has been confined to a wheelchair ever since that night, and lives on the second floor of a large house in Los Angeles with Jane as her main caretaker, lucky her, and her part-time domestic employee Elvira as her only friend and confidant. To say the dynamic between Blanche and Jane is toxic is kind of like saying that Taylor Swift has a couple fans. Jane has become a full-blown alcoholic and treats her sister poorly on a scale from plain rude to outright cruelty, such as when she punishes Blanche for a perceived wrong by roasting and presenting her with her pet parakeet on a bed of meticulously prepared vegetables. Astonishingly, Jane isn't quite altogether upstairs, and she only really gets worse as the plot develops. Later on, we find out there's actually a very, very good reason for this, but that would be telling. What I will spoil for you, however, is that Jane is planning on making a comeback of her old vaudeville act, and so she hires the man, the myth, the legend, Edwin Flagg. He is a beautiful, voluptuous man, as useless as toenails on a duck, and he lives with his mummy, who we on this channel stand very highly. She is a saint among women, and I am so sorry she is cursed with such a useless son. He's so bad, in fact, at literally everything that he has really an easy way into Jane's life and her money, but instead of scamming her out of the money, she actually does it for him in their very first meeting. Watch the movie, you'll see what I mean. To everyone's surprise except the people who made it, the film was a smash hit, making back its budget within only 11 days of its release. It went on to gross about $9 million domestically, which in 2023 money is about $90.4 million, which was a real spit in the eye to Jack Warner and his fellow detractors. Little did Aldrich and his stars know, however, that they had sparked an entire new subgenre. There were copycats that followed, of course, but also standalone films that followed the same elements and tropes that ended up being sort of the formula for Hagsploitation. Here's a couple of my recommendations. Number 1, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte 1964, the spiritual sequel to Baby Jane starring Bette Davis again, as well as Olivia de Havilland. The love of Charlotte's life was murdered mere minutes after breaking her heart, and everyone thinks she did it. 40 years later, her house is in danger of being demolished, and she calls on her cousin Miriam to help her. Also, Agnes Moorehead is fantastic in this. Number 2, Lady in a Cage, 1964, starring Olivia de Havilland again. She plays a filthy rich but disabled poet who lives with her adult son Malcolm, and, when he leaves for a 4th of July get-together, becomes trapped in her house's elevator due to a car accident knocking out her power. She soon finds herself at the mercy of 3 violent criminals hell-bent on destroying her, led by James Garner. The Hagsploitation bit comes with the reveal about how Malcolm and his mother truly feel about each other. And Die, Die, My Darling, 1965, also known as The Fanatic, starring goddess of Broadway Tallulah Bankhead in a very rare film role. A young woman goes to visit her deceased fiancé's mother just before she's due to get married to someone else, and finds that her would-be mother-in-law is a rabid religious fanatic who has very firm ideas about what is and is not acceptable. Secrets come out, and the girl is trapped in the house at Tallulah's mercy. As I said before, this subgenre, like all subgenres, has its own unique tropes and elements that define it. On the meta level, there are 2 rules. First, the actress who plays our protagonist or antagonist, depending on what kind of movie you're watching, is either a former Golden Age star, or, if it's later than the 60s, usually a former leading lady type, both of who have out-aged the type of roles they used to play. And second, but not always, they have had a long and illustrious career up until somewhat recently, but they've had a career slump since. As for story itself, there are several key facets that don't all necessarily have to be present for the film to the subgenre, but are generally included. First of all, the main character, like her actress, was formerly glamorous and beautiful and almost always incredibly stinking rich. Second, she is in some way haunted by her own past, and occasionally they'll use flashbacks as a form of plot development. Third, the setting is in some way isolated, like the Hudson's house in Baby Jane. Fourth, the antagonist or protagonist, depending on the kind of film we're watching, is a young woman, often much younger woman, who has all of the beauty and glamour that the protag/antag had but has lost since. Fifth, there's some sort of twist that appears towards the end point-ish of the narrative. Sixth, the general atmosphere or vibe of the film is sort of gothic horror mixed with melodrama, mixed with at least some camp or kitsch. But lastly, and most crucially, our lead actress is absolutely cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, often to murderous extents, and she absolutely torments everyone around her in some way. Now that we've identified what makes Hagsploitation, why don't we start talking about what actually is the nature of the subgenre, and what better way for me to ruin the fun? Start out by telling you that it is incredibly problematic in so many ways, and academics agree. It's impossible not to acknowledge that the foundations of the subgenre are deeply rooted in misogyny, ageism, and worst of all, the two together, as well as patriarchal influences and stereotypes about women in general. As we said before, aging is utterly unforgivable for a woman, both in Hollywood and, let's be honest with each other here, to an extent in real life as well. The characterization of most of the lead characters in these movies leans on the ugly stereotypes attached to women who are, as former CNN host Don Lemon so wonderfully put it, past their prime. Remember a while ago when I told you what Warner's reaction to Crawford and Davis headlining Baby Jane was? He said this without even a hint of irony at the ripe young age of 70, almost 2 decades older than these actresses. Film scholar Thomas Fiziak has a very dim view of the subgenre, for the perpetuation of these mindsets and stereotypes, saying, Hag horrors, besides their unrestrained camp aesthetic, reveal a highly sexist image of their female protagonist. The heroines evoke the resentment of the audience because they are repulsive, look withered, fight with insanity, or often live thoroughly submerged in a fantasy. It can even be argued that the characterization tropes are kind of reinforcing the idea that women past the age of fertility cease to have a function and something that they can safely point to as their purpose in life and therefore as a person. You can no longer conceive and bear a child, therefore you're not worthy of love or even sexual desire, and therefore you must go absolutely murderously outside your damn mind because of it. Dr. Christopher Pullen, who is a professor of media and inclusivity at Bournemouth University, tends to agree. I appreciate these films are great opportunities for older women to find roles, but in many ways they were demeaning roles that conveyed problematic stereotypes about aging female bodies and the life chances that may be proffered older women. To explore this further, let's consider the criterion that the antagonist or protagonist, whatever movie we're watching, has a younger, often much younger woman as the source of the consternation. She is still young, in the prime of her fertility. She's beautiful, and essentially she has everything that our older woman has had but has since lost due to the ravages of time. Her reaction almost always is to rail against this younger woman out of bitterness, jealousy, and sort of projected self-loathing that she allowed herself to lose all of these things just because she aged. This is another symptom of one particularly deeply ingrained misogynist attitude. Women are either victims or they are enemies, which in that case, I guess they would be victims of each other, so same difference really. We are the overly emotional and illogical and irrational gender, and we can't have relationships with other women like the rational, logical, and always cool-headed men have with each other. We are natural enemies. We're always talking behind each other's backs, after all. And we're a moments away from at each other's throats, as opposed to having, supportive, loving relationships where we uplift each other and support each other and, actually act like humans. But no, this is not how things are for women. This is, of course, in stark contrast to these alpha males who are always keeping their emotions under control, especially if they are accidentally considered gay by someone else. One last issue that I'm going to bring up resonates with me on a really personal level, and that is mental illness, especially the depiction of mental illness in women as being something to fear and to despise as a character flaw. After all, these bitches could snap at any moment and stab you with a plastic fork, right? I'm going to get very real with you for a second here. I have borderline personality disorder, and despite popular depictions in media and widespread pop popular stereotypes. I'm not actually one accidental bump from a stranger away from going full abattoir in the DMV waiting room. Being mentally ill, no matter what the diagnosis, is hard on a day to day basis when you're trying to escape from that reality by going to the movies for 90 minutes. Watching it amplified and sort of blown up on the silver screen hits harder than neurotypical people often can realize. Just for fun, let me share a couple of quick examples from my own past experiences to show you why this can be potentially damaging. One perennial favorite of the keyboard warrior of Twitter is to find out my diagnosis, which I neither hide nor really advertise, and they'll call me a bunny boiler, which of course is referencing 1987's Fatal Attraction starring Michael Douglas and Glenn Close, which has exploitation elements to it, but is not actually Hagsploitation because Glenn Close is young and incredibly sexy and incredibly crazy. That's not BPD, by the way. She doesn't have BPD. She's just incredibly psychotic, unstable, Hollywood crazy. And I love bunnies, personally. And a second one, which has only happened the once, but I think about from time to time because I want to know how that guy's doing, is someone who had watched more than one movie about someone who was absolutely cray-cray, where he likened me to Annie Wilkes of Misery, which is a Hagsploitation adjacent film, by the way. And I was like, bonus points for creativity, and definitely bonus points for comparing me to the incomparable Kathy Bates. Now, here's where I hit you with the Uno reverse card. Sorry for any whiplash that may occur. Despite everything that we just talked about in that section, I actually heavily disagree with the two academics that I have quoted. And in fact, I'd even go as far as to say that if you look past the surface level problematic elements, you'll find that the Hagsploitation subgenre is incredibly feminist in a lot of ways. As we established earlier, Hagsploitation was birthed during that kind of period in between the dying gasps of the Golden Age and the dawn of the New Hollywood era. This was a time of major changes in the industry, and the old ways of doing things were no longer written in stone. The way that things were no longer going to be the way that things are, and the actresses who previously would have been thrown onto the discard pile, as so many had before them, found themselves in a position they never really expected to be in. Previously, there was very little choice but to fade into obscurity after you hit a certain age. Some actresses, like Greta Garbo, went willingly, in her case extremely enthusiastically, I want to be alone. But for actresses like Mary Pickford, they just kind of became isolated hermits. She shut herself in her famous Pickfair mansion, surrounded by the trappings and the reminders of the life that she used to have before her age caught up with her and it all came crumbling down. Post Baby Jane, this was no longer an unavoidable fate. Davis and Crawford both proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only was there a place for these middle-aged actresses in the world, but it would welcome them with open arms, giving them a sort of freedom that they had been denied so often in their earlier careers. In these roles, they were no longer trapped by the confines of these expectations that they had had to deal with before, and given full creative license, allowed to sort of explore and flesh out and inhabit the characters that they were portraying in whatever ways they saw fit, demonstrating their true range. Deborah German, film studies researcher at Roehampton University, explains the liberation these roles provided these women. While often motivated by financial necessity, the women who accepted these roles embodied a memorable rejection of the social constraints placed on older women. In doing this, they actually turned a spotlight on them, and their damning impact on women in the entertainment industry, exposing their shallowness and inequity of a society that ceases to value women as they age. In this respect, women stars playing furious hags in films about the film industry are arguably intriguingly self-referential and critical. They speak to a fury at the whole system. This refreshing agency, coupled with eager, innovative writers who wanted to put a memorable protagonist of their own on the screen, means that the women that we see in these roles are far from 2D, boring, flat characters, especially when played by experienced endgame actresses. Take, for instance, Davis's performance in Baby Jane. At times, she is entirely deranged, manic, and almost cartoonishly cruel to Blanche, such as the aforementioned parakeet and also the additional meal of a rat. Yet, On the other hand, we see her in quiet scenes of internal struggle, such as when she dances and sings her old routine in her living room, only to catch a glimpse at her aged reflection in the mirror. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have Tallulah Bankhead in Die Die My Darling, who throws all subtlety and nuance out of the window as she practically skips into the role of the Bible-thumping absolute madman, Mrs. Trefoil, giving the audience both way over-the-top camp and actual chilling performances as the role befits. There's little about this character that really one could call sympathetic, and Tallulah don't care. She is not trying to go for this being a relatable, sympathetic character. Although the Hagsploitation trend only really lasted for about 10 years or so before it quietly exited the stage, it had and still has influences on the horror and thriller genres for decades afterward, up until today. Hell, in 2022, there was a full-blown Hagsploitation film released, the first in Ty West's planned trilogy of the same name as the film X. It doesn't really completely fall into the subgenre's rules and tropes, mainly because the actress who plays the antagonist of the film Pearl is not a former leading lady who is aged out. It is 28-year-old Mia Goth, who is doing an absolutely stupendous job, and I will forever sing her praises in this film, in the following film Pearl, and in everything that she's in ever. No regrets. X isn't the only example either. Here's some Hagsploitation films from the 21st century that I personally find notable. First, 2019's Ma. Octavia Spencer has the time of her life as the titular Ma, a, quote, cool older lady all of the high school kids love to party with until her mask starts to slip and her true deranged self begins to show. To be honest with you, I'm of two minds about recommending Ma, not because Spencer isn't gorging herself on every morsel of scenery she possibly can when she's on screen, but because when she's off screen, the film kind of slows to a crawl and is utterly dull until she comes roaring back. Second, 2018's Greta. Isabella Huppert titular Greta loses her bag on the subway, and kind, naive Frances, played by Chloe Grace Moretz, finds her and returns it to her, striking up an intergenerational friendship that would be sweet if it wasn't for Greta's story not always adding up, leading to some disturbing revelations. Honestly, I don't really recommend this one. I was pretty disappointed by it. Like, the concept had a lot of great potential, but they ended up dropping the ball pretty hard in some places, and overall, really could have been much better. Finally, 2006's Notes on a Scandal, a far more serious, dramatic take on the typical tropes to the point that it was nominated for several Oscars. Dame Judi Dench is Barbara, a veteran high school history teacher universally loathed by colleagues and students alike. She befriends young art teacher Sheba, played by Cate Blanchett, after coming to her aid during an incident with a student, but discovers that Sheba is hiding a terrible secret and uses it to manipulate her to her advantage. Honestly, cannot recommend this one enough. It is brilliant. It's two titanesses of the stage and screen together, and it leaves you with the most unpleasant pit in your stomach multiple times. So, Hagsploitation, Psycho-Biddy, Grande Dame Guignol, Hag Horrors, whatever you want to call it, doesn't have much recognition outside of your hardcore B-movie fanatics, a surprisingly large queer community fandom, very dedicated fans of niche subgenres such as this one, and other film fans who don't really fall into any category and or study this on an academic level. And I, for one, think that is a goddamn shame. To be sure, it's not without its problems, and it's impossible to separate the entire subgenre from its inherently harmful origin in Hollywood's ageism and sexism. It's also impossible to ignore that many of its common tropes and themes perpetuate harmful stereotypes about women's relationships with each other, about women's mental illness, and about how women age and react to aging, and the patriarchal view of a woman's worth being limited to her ability to be an incubator. However, acknowledging these shortcomings doesn't mean that Hagsploitation wasn't at the same time empowering to its lead actresses, in a time when they were all too often cast aside by the very industry they had dedicated the best decades of their lives to. So it gave them free reign over their own craft, many for the first time in their entire careers, without caveats, without limitations, allowing them to make the characters their own, to show off their range in whatever way they saw fit, going as hardcore, balls to the wall insane, or as quiet and empathetic and demure as they liked, whatever they chose. And that, in my opinion, is what feminism truly strives for. So wrapping things up, if you find your interest piqued by any of what I talked about here today that I didn't quite touch on enough to your satisfaction, whether it's the subgenre's history, whether it's any of the movies that I have recommended or mentioned, if it's the legacy that Hagsploitation left behind, or whatever else, you can find my sources down in the description box below for you to peruse at your leisure. Also, you can find me on Twitter at ObsessiveFilma. It is linked in my YouTube channel bio. And you can ask me questions directly yourself through DMs or just at me, and almost always I will respond to you. So, yeah, I hope you enjoyed hanging out with me as much as I have enjoyed hanging out with you, and I will catch you next time. Bye!